name is Rochelle Davis. I'm an associate professor of anthropology here at Georgetown University, and I'm also the director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. And we're really excited to have this panel today. And it's part of an ongoing sort of occasional series that we've been doing on the sort of modern, the contemporary protests and issues that are happening in the Arab world. And we've done, over the last year, we've done 2 panels on the protests and uprising in Sudan with 6 panelists on who come from Sudan or are Sudanese Americans. We've done a panel on Algeria last spring, also featuring 2 Algerian Americans. And we're excited to have this panel on Iraq. We also are breaking the, of all of the panelists on these, more than 50% of our panelists are women, and so we're trying to outdo Georgetown's, we're trying to not have a whole bunch of all-male panels, which seem to be the trend in Washington, D.C. And so today we have these amazing 4 panelists to talk about understanding the Iraqi protests, critical conversations. And the only way that this is possible is by the panelists themselves organizing this panelist, particularly Shamiran Mako, who put forward the idea. And Shamiran is with the Boston University, and she heads the Institute for Iraqi Studies. And so they have made this possible both intellectually and bringing everybody together as well as financially. The other reason this event is possible is because CCAS has a grant from the U.S. Department of Education, our Title VI grant, to be a national resource center on the Middle East and North Africa. So thank you to those of you who pay taxes in the United States. This is one of the good things that they're going to. I'm going to introduce all 4 panelists, and then all 4 panelists are just going to speak either from here or from the table. Do you want me to take this slide away, Shamiran, or do you want some other slide
up? It's up to you.
Is there one that you think would be?
Yeah, you can take it out.
Or I can just put this one up. What would you prefer?
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I'll just from the beginning, and then everybody has this as the backdrop. So our first speaker is Zahra Ali, who is a sociologist and assistant professor of sociology at Rutgers University, and her research explores the dynamics of women and gender, social and political movements in relation to Islam in the Middle East, and contexts of war and conflicts, all with a focus on contemporary Iraq. And her book is Women and Gender in Iraq, Between Nation Building and Fragmentation, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. Our second speaker is Marcin Shamari, who is a research fellow at the Middle East Initiative in the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School. She's a PhD candidate at the MIT Department of Political Science, where she's working on a dissertation titled Prophets and Priests, Religious Leaders and Protest in Iraq. She's interested in the intersection of religion and politics in the Middle East more generally, with a particular focus on clerical involvement in formal and informal politics. Our third speaker is Yusuf Baqir, who is an assistant professor of international studies and the co-director of the Global Middle East Studies program at California State University, Long Beach. His research looks at the political economy of the American invasion and occupation of Iraq and the broader war on terror. He is also one of the co-founders of the Iraqi Narratives Project, an oral history-based project documenting Iraqi exile and migrant narratives. And our final speaker is Shamiran Mako, who is an assistant professor of international relations at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. Her research lies at the intersection of comparative politics and international relations. And she has a focus on authoritarianism, civil war, democratization, state building, governing in divided societies, and ethnic conflict. She's the co-editor of State and Society in Iraq. She's co-editor of a forthcoming book with Valentine Mogaddam titled After the Uprisings, Progress and Stagnation in the Arab World, and is in the final stages of preparing a manuscript on institutions and ethnic conflict in Iraq. So each of you has about 20 minutes to speak, and then we will open the floor up for questions and conversations with our speakers. So please join me in welcoming all of our speakers.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. Thank you for hosting us. And thank you very much, Shaniran, for setting everything up. And I'll get right into the topic. To understand the current uprising, I think we have to situate it in the continuation of several waves of protest. And here I have to mention something to start. I have to mention that the first significant demonstration, although it was limited in terms of its number and scale, but the very first significant demonstration that was organized in post-invasion Iraq was a women's protest, a feminist protest, denouncing the attempt made by the Shia Islamist political elite that was brought to power by the US administration and its allies in 2003. And this political group was questioning the personal status code, which is a legal frame that gathers most of women's rights, and that is considered in Iraq as pretty progressive, sorry. And so there was an attempt straight away after the invasion to sectarianize or to Libanize the personal status code. The personal status code in Iraq gathers the Sunni and Shia jurisprudence, right? So one of the first demonstrations that was organized in post-invasion Iraq was a women's demonstration. And I'll go back to this point during my, when I conclude. So I want you to keep it in mind. But generally, since 2009, but perhaps even more since 2011 in the context of the Arab uprisings, Iraq has been experiencing waves of protest. Also in Al Anbar region, which is a Sunni majority region, this region also experienced massive protests in 2012 and 2013 that ended up being violently repressed by the Maliki regime. But it's really since 2015 that Iraq has been experiencing an unprecedented movement of popular protest that mobilized a whole generation of its youth and a large segment of its population. The Iraqi protests of 2015 were launched by young male individuals, mostly, under the age of 30 years old. Also by educated, these young men were educated, belonging to the lower middle class and middle class. Mainly they were educators, teachers, or state employees. And this movement of protest carried transformative and influential dimensions, with demonstrations starting in July 2015 and continuing every Friday for a few months, starting from 10,000 of protesters, and at their peak reached almost 1 million people. Under the slogan, some of you maybe are now familiar with it, everyone in Iraq is familiar with Bismiddin Bagod al-Haramiyya, which is the slogan, in the name of religion, we were robbed by looters, right? So protesters put forward the notion of Madaniyya at the time, which could be translated perhaps as civicness. And this concept expresses a fundamental rejection of the Muhasasa system established in 2003 by the US occupation and the Iraqi elites that determines political representation based on communal identity, right? Religious, ethnic, or sectarian. And so this movement in 2015 denounced corruption, demanded a functioning welfare state, redistributing Iraqi rich oil wealth to its citizens. The protests expressed patriotic demand as well, using a lot the Iraqi flag, opposing particularly Iranian influence and more generally any foreign influence in the country. However, the individual who then took leadership of the movement belonged to the older generation, mainly men with former activist experience and affiliated with civil society and political organizations such as the Iraqi Communist Party. And very quickly, the Shia Islamist Sadrist movement, part of the state, quickly appropriated the protest and forged an alliance with secular parties and individuals. And it turned the protest movement into a movement of reforms and created an electoral list that ran in the 2018 election. I don't know if some of you have followed the 2018 elections, but so I conducted field work during the 2015 and 16 protests. And I interviewed activists, including several of the 10 young men that initiated the protest in Baghdad. All of them boycotted the election of 2018. All of them felt betrayed by the centrists and the older civil society activists who took leadership of their movement. The sociologist Ali al-Hamoud, who teaches at sociology at Baghdad University, argues convincingly that the 2015 protests are really the protests of the middle class seeking to assert itself after decades of silence. The end of the UN sanctions in 2003 saw the re-emergence of this middle class, previously destroyed by the sanction and the successive waves. Then we had protests in 2018 that erupted in Basra, which is an oil-rich province from which most Iraq's wealth is extracted, but that has no infrastructure, no basic services. And this wave of protest was different. It refused any type of leadership and stayed away from political groups and coalitions and any centralized organization. It was composed mainly of educated and non-educated young men whose demands went way beyond the notion of Medaniyya and grew towards the rejection of the political system altogether, right? So it's not about the muhassasa anymore for the protesters. Also the protests are mainly in Shia, so it's an intra-Shia situation. But it's about a functioning state. So this is from 2018, I mean we hear it today, but that the slogans such as no to political parties, or Nrid Watan, we want a homeland, or we want a state, that is a slogan very important in today's protest. This is when it started. And so the current protests that erupted at the beginning of October are really following the Basra model in their forms and their demand. It is wider than allowing middle class seeking to assert itself. It is about the poor, it is about the disempowered, it is about the marginals demanding a whole new system. And clearly, the ones who led it, and are still at the core of it today, are people who are like the street merchants, the ones who are paid $6 a day as waiters, for example, the ones who carry heavy boxes in the street markets, the tuk-tuk drivers that are literally the heroes of this uprising, carrying the wounded to the hospital, driving the protesters from one point to another in order to cross the roadblocks. It's also the individuals who fought Daesh, the young men who fought Daesh in Mosul and came back after the fight, and they came back to poverty. And it's interesting because the young men that I interviewed in 2015 and 16 are saying today that it's beyond us, it's beyond the youth who started in 2015. It's actually the generation younger, from the age of 15 years old to like 22, 23 years old. And it's the poor, not the educated middle class. Mostly young men who declare having nothing to lose. And there was clearly, especially in the first week, expression, almost societal expression of despair expressed by many young men, saying, I would rather die for this uprising or this revolution than live without dignity. So these are the ones who started the protest. But however, now a large segment of the population joined the protest. The middle class, the school and university students, the professional and workers' unions. There is a general movement of strike and civil disobedience to the curfew imposed by the Iraqi authorities. And it's followed all over the country. So from there, I think that we can call it a general uprising that forced the Prime Minister to resign. And I think this is very central to understand. It is during the first week of the protest that mercenaries and live ammunitions were used, right? And it is still used in certain situations, of course, but since the wider population during the protest, and that the security forces have been mainly using tear gas canister that of course killed as well, but it is not made for killing. So you can't today easily repress millions of people, right? And I think now it's important to understand as well how violence is deployed. Iraqis are not facing a very strong centralized state or strong unified kind of regime. It's really an elite that is militarized since a decade, but that became hyper-militarized since the war against Daesh that started in 2014. So, and all protests in Iraq have been characterized by armed violence, which includes armed groups and militias led by members or associated to members of the Iraqi political elite. It's important to keep in mind that the previous waves of protests, so in 2011, 2015, and 2018 in Basra they all started after a young man got killed by the security forces. All of these protests. Which also makes us think of transnational comparisons as well, I think. So the worrying dimension of the current situation is that it is often leaders of paramilitary forces and militias related to the political elite, backed by Iran, that are killing, beating up, threatening demonstrators, also threatening civil society activists and journalists. These past few weeks we witnessed the attack of several media channel offices. So it's not sufficient actually to ask the state to stop the violence, because it is beyond the state. And also it's important to understand that armed violence is not only the prerogative of paramilitary groups, militias, or even the state. It is also widely practiced by the biggest social actor after the state, which is tribal leadership, right? So the war against the Islamic State really pushed further the militarization of Iraqi society and the distribution of weapons. Soldiers are now back to civil life, and weapons have been widely distributed beyond state security forces. So I'll end with maybe a few kind of attempts to theorize a little bit what we're talking about. And if we use, for example, Nancy Fraser's notion of redistribution versus recognition, that is kind of a model to understand social movement today. So redistribution would be defined as addressing socioeconomic injustices rooted in the political and economic structure of a society, so issues of exploitation, injustices rooted in deprivation, and economic marginalization, while claim for recognition by social movement tackle symbolic or so-called cultural injustice rooted in patterns of representation. So I would say that if we want to use this model, it is clear that the occupation administration, along with the new Iraqi elite, politics have been dominated by a recognition paradigm, right? In the sense that ethno-sectarian identity politics have been important and institutionalized, right? Whereas the uprising rejects this and the different ways of protest. Instead, protesters are putting forward what the sociologist Faleh Abdel-Jabbar called issue politics, dominated by a redistribution paradigm, especially because these recent protests are mainly, as I said, intra-sectarian. But generally, I think as well that the polarization between the elite and the people also needs to be analyzed beyond identity politics. It needs to be analyzed, and I guess my colleagues are going to also talk about that, by looking at neoliberal economic politics, issues of privatization, the job crisis. Also, it has to be analyzed through the political economy of war, the militiazation, the militarization, right? And also, it has to be analyzed in looking at what Omar Adiwachi told, called the toxicity of everyday life, that I would define here as the structural conditions of everyday life and livelihood, such as health and sanitary infrastructures and environmental conditions as well. And the specificities of the Iraqi context, of course, structured by political and sectarian violence, for so many years, make the rejection of identity politics, especially sectarian identity and religion, really central, right? But it is also related to the demands for individual freedom, especially the freedom not to belong to a religious or sectarian group, as essential as economic reality. So we're really beyond the recognition. People are asking for recognition or redistribution. And it's also where I situate young women's massive participation to this uprising. the demand for economic redistribution is as central as the demand for individual freedom for them. Many youth and many young women, say, نريد نعيش, we want to live. We want to live a life, basically. And this is connected to what I started with, the first demonstration being in Iraq being a women's demonstration. And in my previous work, I analyzed a bit how women's activism was very influenced by the movement of protest in 2015, in the sense that women's feminist activism in Iraq has been, as it is in the whole region, really NGOized. And I think that the emergence of these protests and feminist activists joining the protests really, pushed them to kind of radicalize, or push them outside of the NGO frame, right? And to actually connect issues of gender equality with broader issues of social justice and equality. So I think that it will be very interesting to follow feminist mobilization in the future, and how the current uprising will shape women and feminist debates. Thank you.